India's recent space launch came just a week after Europe's Ariane 5 rocket flew its last mission. With its replacement's debut being pushed back again, has Europe fallen so far behind schedule in its new technology that it'll be old before it even lifts off? Welcome to Roundtable. I'm Philip Hampshire. The race for space supremacy is well underway. India have just launched their latest mission. Private companies owned by some of the richest men on the planet continue to make headlines. And even Russia is supposed to be heading back to the surface of the moon, though that could be on hold for the moment. But in any eventuality, Europe is way behind the rest of its competitors.
India's recent rocket launch showed just how ambitious it's becoming. It aims to be the first to land near the moon's little explored South Pole and just the fourth country to reach the moon.
Ultimately.
Meanwhile, private entrepreneurs like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are battling for supremacy in space. Europe was warned this year it was falling behind in a report commissioned by the European Space Agency. It warns Europe could risk missing out on the next big tech boom and that the space economy is at a similar inflection point to the internet 20 years ago. Ariane 5 has flown its last mission and its successor has been hit by delays. To give an idea of just how far behind Europe is falling, let's look at a single area, putting humans in space. On just this one small part of its operations last year, NASA spent more than ESA's entire annual budget of almost $8 billion. So is it time for Europe to invest or give up on space?
We have an absolutely ram-packed lineup for you today. Joining me in the studio, we have Robert Massey, he's Deputy Executive Director at the Royal Astronomical Society. Meanwhile, in Bilbao, in Spain, Nicolas Niñas, who is a German MEP from the Group of the Greens European Free Alliance. He's also a member of the Committee on Industry, Research and Energy, which is responsible for European space policy. Then across in Los Angeles, in California, we have Joel Sercel. He is the founder and chief executive officer at TransAstra Corporation. TransAstra is developing technologies in the area of orbital logistics and space resources. They move satellites from one orbit to another. And in Houston, in Texas, we have Terry Vitz, who's a retired NASA astronaut, International Space Station commander, and a colonel in the United States Air Force as well. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining me. Robert, let me start off with you. Do you think Europe is falling behind the rest of the world with regards to its space industry?
I mean, fundamentally, no, I don't. And there are many reasons why, which I'll come to, why I take that view. There's been a lot of discussion around this because of the so-called launcher crisis. So the European Space Agency Director General, Joseph Aschbacher, has said there is this crisis in launch capacity because the Ariane 5 vehicle, which has been enormously successful over more than 2 decades in placing payloads in space. A high-profile one recently, for example, would be a couple of years ago, would be the James Webb Space Telescope. Ariane 5 did that, so it was a perfect ESA-NASA collaboration. That's come to the end of its life, and we're waiting a while for Ariane 6, the next rocket, to take its place. At the same time, which is probably later this year, early next year. At the same time, there was an issue with the Vega C rocket, which carries smaller missions into orbit. That had some issues. So there are things going wrong with that and things that need to be fixed. But I think describing it as a big loss of, a long-term loss of capacity would be misplaced. Europe has many member states with very robust science and technology programs, including the UK. I mean, despite Brexit, the UK is a vibrant and active member of the European Space Agency. And as far as I'm aware, very much committed to that. The scientific return, which is the stuff I'm most familiar with, is extraordinary as well. It's not just James Webb and the collaboration with NASA, but the Euclid mission launched recently. Europe was the Organization of Nations that placed the first mission on Saturn's moon Titan. These things are incredible accomplishments that in the next few years we'll see things like a mission to possibly chase an interstellar comet. These are really ambitious things, and it would be wrong to say that it's not second division stuff. This is still really Premier League things. You ought to be proud of that as Europeans.
Nicholas, let me take it across to you. How do you feel about Europe's position in the space industry? Is Europe falling behind all of the other countries in the world? India, China, even Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are getting in on the game. And then, of course, we've got a whole host of private companies too.
Well, we have our homework to do. I think this is fundamental. We have a huge potential in minds, we have a huge potential in companies and in know-how, but we need to harness this. And this is all, I think the biggest problem is the missing investments that we see in other parts of the world being done at the moment. We need to increase that at the moment. And this is what I'm feeling is missing at the moment, where I'm afraid that we could fall behind. But at the same time, I would share the thoughts that has been just mentioned. We have so great capabilities, and therefore I wouldn't say that we necessarily are falling behind, but we need to do our homework now, and we need to get back in line and actually become first in the line.
Okay, Joel, it's the position of the other two guests that Europe isn't falling behind so much. Do you feel that Europe is, or it isn't?
Well, the European space efforts have been solid and are solid. I wouldn't say that they're falling behind. I'd say that they're keeping up with where they have been. I mean, I agree with the other speakers that Europe has done amazing things, and I think the Ariane 6 will be a terrific rocket that sort of competes with the government rockets of the US, sort of like SLS and so on. Europe is no slouch, and you guys should be proud of what you're up to.
Terry, let me bring this over to you then and say, who do you think is winning the space race? Is Europe anywhere near the front of the pack?
Well, I wouldn't call it necessarily one space race. There's a lot of different aspects of space exploration. There's sending probes into the solar system. Europe has been at the forefront of that, exploring Mars, comets, asteroids. That's been a lot of fun seeing what ESA's done. There is astronomy and astrophysics. Europe has done some great things there. When you talk about launch, you need to talk about SpaceX, and they have just created the global launch over the last 5 years. That's going to be hard to beat. And 6 is going to be a great rocket, but it's just not much numbers.
Robert, I have a problem here because all four of you are experts in the field. I'm not, but I'm going to put it to you. Europe may be ahead in terms of, or keeping pace with its peers on the scientific side of things, sort of the things that people were historically looking at. If we look at private enterprise, the fact of the matter is the Starship 1, when it comes through from SpaceX, is going to bring launch costs down absolutely enormously. Isn't that going to put a lot of pressure on a rocket like Ariane 6?
Well, there's certainly, look, credit to SpaceX for that innovation. Okay, undoubtedly, I think the ambitious risk-taking approach, some aspects of that I approve of, like the idea that you would do the ridiculous thing of bringing the first stage back to the launch pad. That's been incredibly successful, and I think probably it was hard to believe it could be done to begin with. So there are lessons there. That's absolutely fair. I still think there's a place for Europeans, if you like, sovereign capacity or regional capacity in these things, and it's important not to just rely on one provider. Part of the issue with the launcher crisis is doing that. They actually look around and you think, well, the most recent scientific mission, Euclid, needed a SpaceX rocket, needed Falcon to get into space. And we wouldn't want, I think, as a community of European nations to be entirely dependent on external providers, but even setting aside the geopolitics, because if they will have other priorities, it's a really good idea to have that overall capacity across the piece. I don't believe for 1 second that European companies and private sector individuals and all the rest of it are not capable of matching that if they put the money. I would agree that there's an issue of investment too that Nicholas was pointing out, that actually we perhaps haven't been as committed to this as, say, the US, although it's complicated to compare.
Because we've got the public-private element here, which we'll get into in just a second.
The NASA budget also includes a lot of scientific research in a different way to ESA, and a community of democracies coming together is more complicated even than getting the different US states to work together with the federal government and the private sector contracts that come in there as well. So it's difficult to compare them.
Right, well, Joel, I think I have to turn to you because you're an entrepreneur with a space company yourself, and I'm going to put it to you that the European Union cannot possibly be a peer with the US space industry because ESA, the European Space Agency, gets 7.15 billion euros worth of funding, and even that's double what it was getting a decade ago, and you have private enterprise over in the States pouring vast amounts of cash into space.
Well, I mean, you're right. NASA has roughly 3 times the budget of ESA. That's not nothing. Also, a significant amount of technology in the US comes from the Department of Defense. Europe only spends typically less than 2% of its GDP on defense. whereas a lot of technology funding in the US comes from the DoD. We also have very interesting government programs that help the private sector and entrepreneurs. For example, in the US, we have a program called SBIR, the Small Business Innovative Research Program, which takes a fraction of all the R&D budget in the government, and it sort of earmarks it for small businesses, and it helps us develop basic technology and commercialize those technologies. And the Space Force, the new organization in space in the US, has been heavily investing in small businesses there. In the launch vehicle industry, there are about a dozen really exciting small launch companies coming up in the US that have been funded through these public-private partnerships. And you can't minimize the importance of venture capital in the United States. You know, my own company, Transastra, is a graduate of Y Combinator, which is the most successful venture incubator in Silicon Valley. Y Combinator companies have a total valuation that's approaching $1 trillion right now. And there are billions of dollars of venture money that goes into tech in the US in areas like space, biotech, and AI. And this is just really exciting. And it's why so many people come to the United States to start businesses.
Joel,
you know, it's no coincidence. Go ahead.
I've got to take this across to Niklaus because he grimaced very heavily there when I said that Europe can't possibly compete with the United States because of the difference between public funding and the private funding. Niklaus, the simple truth is, as Joel's been saying, there is vast amounts of private money, whether it's from venture capitalists, whether it's from hedge funds, whether it's from government organizations, that the US can tap into that Europe just hasn't made available.
That is correct. What I was grim at especially was the fact that we don't just have the ESA budget, but also the national budgets from every member state additionally. In overall, the European space budget is very fragmented, which makes it complicated to see how much we actually invest in the sector of space. You also have the EU as a player, and you have players like Britain, who are not part of the EU, but are part of ESA, others as well. But at the same time, you're right. We have venture capitalists bringing so much more money in through the private market than we have in Europe. The European investors tend to be not so risk averse than the Americans. But at the same time, I would say that the American side did something very smart, and they used the money that they have from the public side to also build up investments and build up markets to make it easier for capitalist investors to invest into the market. And that's something that we're missing, but with reversing that trend. For example, with ESA's strategic plan that was announced, I think, 3 years ago, there was already made sure that this change is coming in the future. With the new constellation that we have from the EU, IRIS², we made sure that we want to include more and more investors and more possibilities from outside. So we're going the steps. They're smaller steps, but they're a little bit more risk defined. I think this makes more sense for the European investors. But yet we need to follow up and to make sure that the investments are being pulled in. But at the same time,
hold on.
Investments.
Hold on, let me take this across to Terry. Terry, as a man who's been into space, do you want to go into space on a rocket that's been built by a government agency, or do you want to go into space on a rocket that's been built by a private company? I forget which astronaut it was who quipped, when you're sitting there at the top of this rocket, you realize it was built by the lowest bidder. Yeah, it's got to be nervous either way, hasn't it?
That's absolutely that's a thing. I think it was John Glenn. And you know, when SpaceX just launched their Starship and it blew up, and all their engineers were cheering, and I was thinking to myself, I want to fly on a rocket where the engineers don't cheer when it blows up. So that's probably my thing. And this is a great discussion because the idea of venture capital is very important. I've talked with a couple of European space companies that are really innovative. They've got young, millennial, hungry people doing some really cool things with innovative rocket engine technology and satellite technology. But at the end of the day, America and Europe are friends. You know, there's always friendly competition is a good thing. The UK and France are always going to have, you know, something there. But at the end of the day, they're on the same team. China is a very different animal. It's an authoritarian dictatorship that wants to dominate the globe. And at the end of the day, I think America and Europe need to work together to make sure that China steals our technology. They just blatantly steal it, and they're using it for not promoting democracy and freedom around the world. So I think at the end of the day, we need to, and governments need to realize that, hey, let's work together to make sure that, the authoritarian future that the British author George Orwell predicted does not come true.
Joe, I saw you nodding to a lot of that.
100%. If there's an emerging space race, it involves China. And in terms of the diversity of launch companies and launch vehicles, China is winning in diversity in launch. They have a very sophisticated, much newer space station than we do. Their operations in lunar orbit are impressive, but their behavior on the world stage as good citizens on the world stage is not impressive. And what they've done in the South China Sea, basically, declaring ownership of international waters, they've essentially said they're going to do the same thing in the lunar environment. And the real threat that we need to take into strong consideration is China. And how are we going to compete together as friends to make sure that space is open for business, for freedom and democracy, and not weaponized excessively? China is the threat here.
Let me take this across to Robert.
Well, I mean, to comment on that, yeah, I think actually the crucial thing I agree, the race, if there is one, is predominantly between the US and China, Europe and China to an extent as well. There are some, we shouldn't exclude the fact there are still scientific collaborations between Eastern and China. I think that's fine, as long as they obey certain norms and we have those assurances in place. But yes, it's quite true, of course, an authoritarian dictatorship in some ways, when it's got enough cash, can dictate that these things happen and make them happen. And that's much harder with a community of democracies. If we sit there and say, we want to multiply the space budget in Europe by a factor of 10, we have elected politicians that will argue about that, and that's entirely reasonable. I think they've done fantastic things. Actually, I'm delighted by the fact that China put a rover on the far side of the moon. There's rhetoric about how it leads to imperialism and mining and so on. We're so far from that. That's not the immediate issue. It's more about how that's reflected in their behavior on Earth. And in geopolitics as well, you look at what the war in Ukraine did immediately to Russian-European cooperation. It ended it. That was part of the launcher crisis, and part of the challenging capacity is that we no longer had Soyuz to use, which had been that symbol of friendship. And the sole one remaining really is the International Space Station. And that's, I guess, simply the practicalities. The US and the Russians have to work together on that to keep it going.
But how useful can Europe really be as an ally to the United States in regards to space, given that Europe sort of looks at space and it goes, well, we've got telecommunications, we've got science, and we've got defense. And those are the three things we really deal with in space. Whereas the Americans are going after it and going, hey, let's do some commerce. Let's find an asteroid eventually. Eventually, maybe we'll get some platinum and some gold and some rare earth metals. But there seems to be this commercial aspect to it.
Yeah, that's true. And
Maybe,
that's a
eventually,
slightly speculative
Yes.
thing. Yes, I suspect that will happen at some point. It's, there's a lot of discussion you could have around the feasibility of mining and so on. But look, space is there for many aspects of our lives as well that we just take for granted. The long distance communications, navigation, it would be inconceivable that we fly our planes without it now. If you take away those systems, and that's one of the threats of militarization, you very quickly make things much, much harder on Earth. It's kind of like setting us back a few decades in terms of the way we live and move. We understand issues like climate change because of space, because we can see the Earth as a whole from space. So the price, yes, there are greenhouse gas emissions from launches into space, but we understand exactly what they're doing to the planet as a result of those monitoring systems. Without them, it would be much harder. It's not just about long-term commerce stuff. That's a part of it. I don't see any reason that Europe will be excluded from that.
Nicholas, Robert doesn't believe that we're going to see a long-term fall behind for Europe. I'm going to put it to you, though. One of the reasons that we don't have quite so much private money in space in Europe is it's just over-regulated and there's too much red tape.
Yeah, but the situation that we have at the moment in Europe is that we have too lax regulations. Actually, the international regulations that we have don't really allow for private entities to securely join in. While in the US, they are using the current system, I think unlawfully in the international regards, to the benefit of private entities. We're missing out in Europe. We need a European space law to counter this, but we also need international regulations to make sure that we have a clear construct for private entities in the future. And this would be something where Europe and the US could walk together and also diverse to China in this regard. But for that, we need to have a common agreement. And I want to make something very clear. The space in space is not endless. The orbits that we're using at the moment are very sparse. And at the moment, they're being populated, especially by SpaceX, for example, by Starlink. And this is a problem if we want to have a fair competition in the future and not just one that is dominated by US monopolists.
Joel, I think Nicholas there alluding to Kessler syndrome, being a little bit worried about it. Let me bring it across to you. Because you're an entrepreneur, I've never in my life met an entrepreneur that would agree with the statement that the thing this industry needs more is regulation. So that's Nicholas's position. Is that yours as well?
Most entrepreneurs that I know believe that regulation needs to be smart and appropriate and not overregulated. The issue we have with regulation right now, both in the United States and globally, as the current regulation is directed towards the space age as it was, as opposed to how it is and how it's becoming. Space used to be the province of giant multinational corporations and governments. But the emerging space age is about entrepreneurialism and the private sector. And the regulations haven't been modified to keep up with that. So, for example, I think concerns of orbital debris are very serious. And, you know, just in the last year, SpaceX launched approximately as many good-sized satellites into low Earth orbit as had been launched into space in the last 30 years, say up to about 5 years ago. So the traffic is getting really considerable in low Earth orbit. The amount of debris is getting considerable. And that's why TransAstra is focusing on core technologies that will eventually lead to asteroid mining. But today they include things like telescopes for space domain awareness to find that debris. We also find asteroids. We just recently won a NASA contract to look at using our asteroid capture bag technology to clean up orbital debris. Advanced propulsion technology that lets us get around in orbit better for things like deploying satellites more efficiently and cleaning up orbital debris, and materials processing to make use of that material in space. So the regulation needs to be altered to encourage responsible behavior on the part of governments and private sector. And so it needs to be updated.
Terry, when I was 5 years old, I was promised jetpacks, I was promised flying cars, and I was promised colonies on the moon. And we sort of had about a 30-year period there where we kind of gave up on all of those dreams. Are those dreams now back on the table, or is this another false start? What do you think?
Well, flying cars are coming. I think we just had the first commercial car, electric flying car. Those I think are going to be happening in the near future. You know, NASA has the Artemis program to go back to the moon, hopefully to do a little bit more sustainable activities on the moon. So I think those things are going to happen. But the reality is it's expensive to get to the moon. I mean, the dollars per kilogram to go in a low Earth orbit is still expensive. Those costs have come down, but to get to the moon is very expensive. To get to Mars is extremely expensive. And the bigger problem with Mars is the amount of time it takes. That's just a lot of time in deep space, which means a lot of time in radiation for humans. The good news is we have some pretty amazing robotic exploration programs that I think are very exciting. But to go back, I just want to change subjects and talk about space debris. Completely agree. That is the number one problem facing Earth. Starlink has launched thousands, or they're about to be tens of thousands of satellites. China has a mega constellation. Jeff Bezos wants to launch one. Europe has one. And so we need some type of smart, intelligent regulation that prevents us from creating this debris. I had to maneuver the space station in 2015 to avoid debris that the Chinese had caused in 2007 from a military explosion. They did an anti-satellite demonstration. And since then, that's a terrible idea. It's an absolutely awful idea. Since then, India did one a couple of years ago. Russia did one right before the start of their war last year in Ukraine. And these debris fields stay there for years or decades. If they're high enough, they'll be, 500 years from now, humans are going to be really upset with our generation for the mess that we created that's still there. So we really need to be smarter about that and stop doing military kinetic explosions in Earth orbit.
Well, on that note, I'm very sorry, everyone, but I'm afraid we've run out of time. So, Terry, Robert, Niklaus, Joel, thank you very much, all four of you, for joining me today. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate if you head on over to our YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me here and the entire team, thank you for watching and goodbye.